Hey, what are you doing here sleeping? But you're not telling me to take this, are you? Sean, always particular about food, seemed to have keenly spotted the frozen food in the lunchbox. Sorry. Mom's got a fever of 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Struggling with a high fever since this morning. I stood up and reached to close the lid of the lunchbox. However, Sean roughly swatted the lunchbox off the table. Hey, what are you doing? I raised my voice, despite being feverish. Sean's face flushed with anger and his body trembled with rage. He grabbed a vase from the table and hurled it at me with all his might. Don't you dare slack off on housework, you leech off dad. Sean, the son of my husband Tom, and his ex-wife had become increasingly hostile towards me as he grew up. But this was the first time he had gone to such extremes. I dodged the vase thrown by Sean, staggering. As to have been my scolding that infuriated him. I couldn't let it go, but I didn't have the luxury to deal with Sean right now. I felt so sick. I could collapse any moment. Enough, enough.
Suddenly, a shout came from behind me.
It was unmistakably Tom's voice, and I thought he was scolding me. I told him about my poor health last night. It was too much to be yelled at just for cutting corners on the lunch. As I turned around fearfully, there stood Tom, looking furious as I had never seen before, his shoulders shaking with anger. At Tom's feet, fragments of the vase thrown by Sean were scattered and wet the floor. In Tom's arrival, Sean looked at me as if to say, "See, I told you so." Just as Sean began to smirk, Tom uttered something unbelievable. Up to me, my name is Sally Manson. I'm a 49-year-old housewife. I married Tom, my current husband, when I was 42. This is my first marriage, but it's Tom's second. I met Tom at my previous job. I was doing office work, and Tom, a sales representative who visited often, became an acquaintance. Virtually not good at socializing, I was drawn to Tom's earnest and honest nature as we talked. Tom had a son from his previous marriage. I was surprised when I learned he had been married before. As could a serious man like him also have a marriage that didn't last? That's what I initially thought, but after hearing the details from Tom, I felt sympathetic. Tom's ex-wife seemed to be quite the partygoer, and it turned out that their divorce was due to her infidelity. Tom knew about her bad habits since they were dating, but he believed she would change. However, no matter how hard Tom tried, the outcome never changed. Despite her promises to never do it again, the ex-wife repeatedly cheated. Even after their son was born, her habits didn't cease, leading Tom to a tough decision to divorce. He couldn't leave his son in such an environment. Tom deeply loved the son he had with his ex-wife. The son's name is Sean, now a 21-year-old college student. Although there's no blood relation between Sean and me, he became my son when I married Tom. I was introduced to Sean during our dating period and had met him several times. I first met Sean when he was 10. It was a delicate issue, so Tom and I took our time to discuss it with Sean. No matter how much we loved each other, if Sean had rejected the idea, that would have been the end of it. Being an elementary schooler, it must have been hard for him to understand everything. Honestly, it didn't seem to be that important to Sean. At any particular rejection, Sean became my son. But when we started living together, Sean's troublesome nature became apparent. Tom works in sales at a major insurance company. He's earnest by nature and raised Son alone after the divorce with his ex-wife. While taking care of Sean, Tom managed his job well and has risen to a managerial position. Through his hard work, Sean never had to experience any hardship. However, there are limits to single parenting. Tom often came home late from work and had to leave Sean alone. Although his parents lived not too far away, Tom, being serious, didn't want to rely on them too much. This led to him being overly indulgent with Sean. He compensated for his absence by buying Sean various things and spoiling him. Sean grew up cunning, just learning that he could get anything he wanted by behaving well in front of his father. He became adept at misbehaving without adults noticing. I met Sean at exactly that time. For Sean, my presence was nothing but a nuisance. He probably thought that a new mother figure would restrict his freedom. However, he didn't oppose the marriage because he saw me as an outlet for his stress. Or even as a child, he exploited my delicate position. Before the marriage, I was a guest and Tom prioritized me. But once married, we were a family. Sean understood this and knew that Tom would put his own flesh and blood first. Whose words would Tom believe first, mine or Sean's? When the three of us started living together, Sean's attitude towards me changed drastically, and his harassment began. I was prepared for some rebellion from an elementary school boy, but I was shocked when Sean first spouted, "You're getting fed by Dad, so it's only natural to take care of me, right?" What I say goes. Remember that? When I heard these words, I was furious. These aren't words a child should say to a parent, and they're disrespectful. And they're unacceptable. Sean, do you realize what you just said? Even as a joke, there are things you shouldn't say. Think about why Mom is so angry now. Sean just smirked at my words, seemingly enjoying the situation of being scolded. It was eerie to see him smirking while listening to my serious reprimand. He fully understood his position as a stepchild and how we were perceived by others. Never having much interaction with children before, I was horrified by his cunning. I never imagined a child could say such things. First that night, when Tom came home, I told him about the incident with Sean. His unnerving behavior, the verbal abuse towards me. It appealed to Tom while nearly panicking. But contrary to my expectations, Tom's reaction was just as Sean had predicted. "Sean said that to you?" "No way! Aren't you exaggerating a bit? Sean's not the kind of kid to say such things." Tom didn't take my report seriously and refused to believe Sean's harsh words. No matter how much I insisted, Tom's reaction remained unchanged. In fact, he seemed irritated by my persistence. Ellie just finds Sean, who isn't her real son, bothersome. He implied this without saying it directly, but his actions hinted at such doubts. Let's drop this topic.
"You used to care so much for Sean before we got married. I'm disappointed in you," Tom said, sighing deeply.
I never wanted to hear such words from Tom's mouth. Despite everything, I had been seriously engaging with Son. I no longer thought of him as just someone else's child. But from Tom's perspective, As Sean's biological father, maybe he saw things differently. I felt crushed by Tom's words. If I said more, it might even worsen my relationship with Tom. So I felt it was better not to discuss Sean anymore.
Sean, who had secretly witnessed this, gained confidence. Believing Dad really trusts me.
Still, there were times when my patience reached its limit. If things continued like this, Sean would grow into a terrible adult. I was afraid of damaging my relationship with Tom, but each time I reprimanded Sean and consulted Tom. However, the outcome was always the same. Even when I directly asked Sean, he dismissed it. Why would I say such things to Mom? You must have misunderstood, or it's a mistake. Does Mom really find me that bothersome? Sean exploited my position and used it to wedge himself into Tom's heart. If this continued, it would play right into Sean's hands, and irreparable cracks might appear in my relationship with Tom. The parental feeling of doing it for Sean's sake eventually got buried deep. I made sure to keep my feelings about Sean's behavior buried deep in my heart and even put a lid on my own emotions. I didn't want to resort to such negative thinking, but I knew Sean would eventually leave home, and I just had to endure until then. Maybe one day his feelings towards me would change, and he might apologize. Despite interacting with Sean every day, I knew the chances of that happening were slim. Yet I had no choice but to encourage myself with such thoughts and deceive myself into enduring each day desperately. It was on a day when Sean's high school graduation was near. Placing under the guidance of a top-notch tutor, Sean had secured admission to one of the top universities in the state. Taking his acceptance as a relief, he began to act even more arrogantly than before. That day, Tom was away on a business trip for a few days, leaving the house empty. In the evening, after finishing all the chores, I waited for Sean's return. Since Tom wasn't there, it was going to be just the two of us for dinner, so I prepared a substantial menu as usual. However, Sean didn't return home even after his Yule time. I began to worry, thinking something might be wrong. I sent a message to Sean's phone, but there was no reply. As it was past 8 p.m. and still no word from Sean, but I didn't start dinner waiting for him to come home. Not an hour later, I heard noisy voices outside the house. That sweat with a bad feeling. I opened the front door to find Sean standing there with a group of young men and women. "Sean, you're home," I said, bewildered. "I'm going to throw a party, so can you leave?" Sean said with a click of his tongue upon seeing me. From behind, I heard the boys and girls urging, "Hurry up, let's get started." "Sean, I made dinner waiting for you to come home. Can't you have it with me instead of partying?" To the idea of college students gathering for a party at this hour was simply unacceptable. "Look, I care," Sean said. "This is my house, so get out of the way." Sean shouted and pushed past me into the house, followed by the others. I stood helplessly watching them enter. Soon, loud music started playing inside, accompanied by the students' noisy voices. This was going to be a nuisance to the neighbors. Holding my ears, I hurried to Sean, weaving through the students. "Stop the music right now," I yelled, trying to be heard over the music. However, Sean deliberately ignored me, pretending not to hear. Overwhelmed by the students' enthusiasm, I felt powerless. I don't know how much time had passed when I began to hear sirens mixing with the loud music. The sirens were from the police, called by the neighbors, as expected. As the parent, I got a thorough scolding, and Sean and his friends were ordered to disperse. I was mortified and sorry for causing such a nuisance over something so trivial. But while the police were there, Sean acted meekly, but once everyone left, he started complaining to me. Who ratted us out? That's so annoying. Let him set to decide the next day. When Tom returned from his business trip, I reported the incident and asked him to talk to Sean. But you're not a kid anymore. Act like an adult and live in a way that's not embarrassing.
Lectured Sean, who for once apologized to me sincerely. And then Sean went with Tom to apologize to the neighbors.
Received a good scolding from them and came back with tears in his eyes,
That Sean had truly reflected and changed, but my hopes were quickly dashed. One night, after Sean had started college and some time had passed, I was suddenly struck by a chill. Fearfully, I checked my temperature with the thermometer. 99.5 degrees Fahrenheit. I had a slight fever. I didn't have any symptoms of a cold, but my body felt heavy and my head was a bit cloudy. I told Tom I'd go to bed early just to be safe and went to sleep. The next morning, my alarm clock rang precisely at 5 a.m. as usual to prepare Sean's lunch. When I opened my eyes, I was hit with a severe headache, barely able to lift myself up. Somehow I managed to get out of bed and checked my temperature. The time by knuster is he estidet kosil porten 4 degrees Fahrenheit. This was serious, but first I had to prepare Sean's lunch. I staggered to the kitchen, leaning on tables and walls. In my state, I couldn't possibly cook properly. I usually pack all homemade dishes, but today I decided to fill the lunchbox with some frozen meals I had bought for myself. Though frozen, they were tasty and nutritionally balanced. So in my feverish state, I managed to prepare Sean's lunch. Perhaps due to the relief of finishing the lunch, I fell asleep for a while on the dining chair and was awoken by Sean's voice. Hey, what are you doing sleeping here? But you're not telling me to take this, are you?
I was pointing at the lunchbox cooling on the table.
Sorry, Mom. I've got a fever of 104 degrees Fahrenheit. I stood up and reached to close the lid of the lunchbox. However, Sean briefly swatted the lunchbox off the table. Hey, what are you doing? I raised my voice, despite being feverish. Then Sean's face flushed with anger, and his body trembled with rage. He grabbed a vase from the table and hurled it at me with all his might. Don't you dare slack off on housework. You leech off Dad. I dodged the vase thrown by Sean, staggering. My scolding must have really gotten to him. I couldn't let it go, but I didn't have the energy to deal with Sean right now. I felt so sick. I could collapse any moment. Suddenly, a shout came from behind me. That voice was undoubtedly Tom's, and I thought he was scolding me. I had told him about feeling unwell last night. It seemed too much to be scolded for taking a shortcut with the lunchbox. When I timidly turned around, there stood Tom, looking angrier than I had ever seen him, his shoulders shaking with rage. At Tom's feet, lay the shattered pieces of the vase Sean had thrown, wetting the floor. Sean looked at me with an "I told you so" expression as Tom appeared. Just as Sean began to smirk, Tom yelled again, "Sean, I'm talking about you." Sean froze at Tom's unexpected scolding, and I was too shocked to follow what was happening. "Huh, what are you talking about, Dad?" Sean, clearly shaken, began to tremble and approached unsteadily, looking like he was about to cry.
You're sick. You need to rest.
Look, you're sick. You need to rest, Tom said, staring down at Sean as he approached me. Just leave this to me.
I timidly looked up at Tom's face and slowly nodded. Supported by Tom, I sat down on a nearby chair.
Thank you, Tom, said Tom as he sat me down, then began to clean up the broken vase pieces, ignoring Sean. After collecting the fragments, he carefully wiped the wet floor and picked up the scattered flowers. The heavy atmosphere made it impossible for Sean to say anything.
He clearly understood what was about to happen. Tom, turning back to Sean, had eyes blazing with intense anger. Kisamtalasi, if no longer a child of this house. He muttered sternly, glaring at Sean, "Do you understand what you've done to your mother?" In the silent kitchen, Tom's heavy words echoed.
And what are you saying? Trying to respond jokingly despite being in a panic, said, "Stop with the bad jokes." And they're not funny.
Tom's words made it clear that Sean was no longer welcome in the house and needed to leave immediately. "Leave immediately,"
the instructor said, looking perplexed.
To your classroom buzz with whispers.
"What? That can't be. There must be some mistake."
Sean pleaded desperately.
The instructor left a check, saying, I'll confirm it.
Meanwhile, Sean responded with forced composure to the curious glances, saying, "No worries." Teacher's just confused. What a fuss over nothing, he said, but a terrible premonition raced through his mind.
"No way." After a while, the instructor came back and said matter-of-factly, "It's confirmed. Sean, your withdrawal has been processed." The classroom buzzed even more at the instructor's words, and Sean was engulfed in despair. Filled with embarrassment, Sean's face turned bright red as he dashed out of the classroom. "This can't be happening, right? Like what's going on?" he muttered to himself as he sprinted down the long hallway. Why was the thought dominating his mind, escaping his lips unintentionally? Sean pulled out his phone and dialed Tom's number. However, Tom had blocked his calls, and Sean couldn't get through. Panicked, Sean hurried to his grandparents' house. Not when he arrived, he saw his bag thrown outside the front door. "What's this?" His panic intensified as he rang the doorbell. Getting no response, he frantically knocked on the door. "Grandma, Grandpa," he cried tearfully, but there was no answer from inside. At that moment, Sean realized he had been betrayed by his grandparents. With nowhere else to go, Sean grabbed his discarded bag and headed home, praying it was all a mistake. But everything pointed to the harsh reality. Sean, sobbing, rang the doorbell of his home, and you answered. "What's happening? I know I was wrong. Please help me." He begged tearfully. You let him in, and Sean, feeling a sense of relief, cried even louder. As planned, you took Sean to the room where Tom was waiting. "What do you plan to do by coming here now?" Tom's words filled Sean with despair again. "Sir Tebow, I wasn't forgiven. He couldn't return to this house." You said coolly, like adding insult to injury. The grandparents had initially taken Sean in his plant, only to later turn him away. The shock would be greater this way. It was a retaliation for Sean's betrayal and pretense. In the pretense of repentance, he needed to experience firsthand the pain I had endured. The decision to withdraw you from college won't be reversed. If you want to continue your education, figure out the tuition on your own. I hadn't thought of going that far, but it was Tom's decision. He wanted Sean to fully experience the consequences of his actions. Before I married Sally, I made you endure many lonely moments. That's why I always put you first, even over Sally. You always played the good boy in front of me, and I believed you were reflecting on your mistakes. Stepchild had spoiled Sean, aware of his leniency but feeling pity for him losing his mother due to parental decisions. He thought the conflicts between Sean and me, his stepmother, were inevitable and believed Sean never crossed the line. However, Sean's continuous verbal abuse and finally throwing a vase at me were the last straws for Tom. He decided to push Sean away, realizing his upbringing had contributed to such vile behavior. He couldn't forgive Sean for tormenting me for years and didn't want to believe it. Taking everything from Sean and pushing him away was, in a way, a punishment for Tom himself. Sean cried and clung to Tom, but Tom's mind was made up. Set out of a sliver of compassion, Tom handed Sean just enough money to live on for a month. In this limited time, he has no choice but to figure things out on his own. Sean, having been pampered all his life and having everything go his way, was now facing his own hell. His withdrawal from college meant missing out on a promised elite path and ending up with just a high school diploma. He was cut off from his parents and grandparents, now forced to live on his own. The grandparents had always doted on Sean as their grandson, but their views changed after Tom revealed my long suffering at Sean's hands. No matter how beloved a grandchild, some things are unforgivable. Initially hesitant about disowning him, they agreed to cooperate, considering both Tom's firm stance and Sean's behavior. They let Sean in only to turn him away later, a more impactful shock than outright rejection. Sean rented a rundown apartment the same day, a place with shared bathroom facilities, thin and dingy walls. Any loud partying would get him kicked out in an instant. Staring at his dwindling funds, Sean wept. He had lost his home, his family, and his friends who had always taken advantage of his lavish lifestyle. Act now, without any allies, his future was bleak. He'd never worked a day in his life. How could such a pampered person find a job? Or to survive, he would have to take any job, no matter how tough. As these thoughts crossed his mind, Sean's tears wouldn't stop. A year had passed since Sean left our house. Tom had started to prioritize me again, like when we first met, recovering our relationship that had been centered around Sean for the past decade. I too could now enjoy my relationship with Tom without constantly thinking about Sean. I'm truly sorry for all the pain I caused you, but blinded by my love for my son, I lost sight of everything else. I had never voiced it before, but every time Tom criticized my words towards Son, I felt deeply troubled, sick even. I felt attacked for not being his biological mother. Even though Sean legally became my son, there was one aspect that could never be changed. He felt crushed, as if this unchangeable fact was constantly being used against me. Now, I can talk about it, but Tom always had this delicate matter in the back of his mind. He never meant it in a bad way. He was resolved never to speak of it to me. Learning how much this troubled me, Tom began to apologize whenever the opportunity arose. Sean's departure freed us from various entanglements. Whether he knew it or not, Sean started sending us letters periodically. They weren't about wanting to mend our relationship, but more about updating us on his situation. It must have been his way of apologizing. Since that day, he's been desperately looking for work, getting by day to day through manual labor. Tom doesn't say anything, but he seems a bit relieved reading those letters. He won't reach out to him anymore, but it feels like a burden has been lifted off our shoulders. At our age, having children of our own is difficult, but it looks like we can live happily together now. Until now, life has been more about enduring hardships than enjoying it. But from here on, I can live my life. A bright and enjoyable life.